U.S. Marine Corps and Silver Star recipient William Whorton, who was both enlisted and an officer in the U.S. Marines, spent 2 combat tours in Vietnam. A polyglot fluent in several Chinese and Vietnamese dialects and well-traveled to both countries. Today, Whorton continues his Vietnam War Insane Asylum series by explaining a foreign concept that was the backbone and driving force motivation for the North Vietnamese during the war.
Hello, I'm Bill Whorton, and I'm back to talk about Vietnam again. And today we're going to focus on a Vietnamese term called Giải phóng. Now, Giải phóng means liberation. Now, before we get into liberation, because it's a complicated subject. It's religious, it's metaphysical, it's moral, and it's also very, very pragmatic. So it has to do with the transcendental, it has to do with morality, it has to do with pragmatism, it has to do with our war in Vietnam. Before we get into it, I'd like to kind of just go over why I got into Giải phóng, because I think it's kind of important for our friends out there to understand why I got so interested in this topic. Because for me, it became an obsession, although at the time I didn't quite understand it. Now, just to kind of go back and go over why I got into Giải phóng, as I got into Giải phóng, it started for me about 4 months into my first tour in Vietnam, where I was an infantry platoon commander. Now, when I was infantry platoon commander, and I mentioned before that on previous occasions, I was tired at the end of 4 months of combat, and I was writing my mommy. I said, "Mom, the war's over and we've lost." Now, at that time, I was a second lieutenant. I never considered myself a strategic genius of any kind, or there was nothing. There was just something intuitive in my consciousness, in my inner consciousness, and it wasn't just me. It was also a number of my men. For example, I'd be walking the lines at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'd be talking to my Marines, and they would be saying, "Sir, what are we doing here? These people hate our guts. I mean, why are we here?" Kind of thing. And we had no real concept of why we were there. And also, we were dealing with a leadership that was mendacious. In other words, it was a leadership that was telling us, "Oh, the people love you. The people will love you. You're going to be saving their country, and they're going to be so grateful for you for saving their country," and all this kind of stuff. And there we were as infantry platoon, going out, getting booby trapped, getting our legs blown off, getting killed, and getting mutilated. And almost every village we went into, it was punji stakes and hate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the world we lived in. We lived in an insane asylum. So that was the world of the insane asylum. Now, I left Vietnam on March 31st, 1966. I was wounded, and I was wounded the day that I was supposed to return home. I was supposed to get an evening flight out of Da Nang on March the 31st in the evening, and I got wounded in the afternoon of March the 31st, 1966. But on my way back home, I became obsessed with, why are we losing this war? I didn't understand, because we had the technology, we had the bombs, we had the aircraft, we had the artillery, we had everything. I mean, we had technologies and material benefits that are just literally unbelievable. But anyway, I knew we were losing, and I was obsessed with why. So I determined at that time to go back to Vietnam and learn the reason why we were losing. So I plotted and schemed, and when I was at the hospital, at the Great Lakes Naval Hospital, I arranged for orders to go to Vietnamese language school, because in my first tour in Vietnam, I understood absolutely nothing about the people, nothing about the culture, nothing about anything. And I was determined to go back speaking fluent Vietnamese, fluent French, and some Chinese. I was able to scheme and plot my way back to become a senior battalion advisor, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Regiment, 1st Arvin Infantry Division that was then fighting along the DMZ. And I spent 11 months living with the South Vietnamese Army under the U.S. Army Command. I was one of the very few Marine Corps officers attached to the Army at that time. I was living with the South Vietnamese Army, and I did that for 11 months. Then the Insane Asylum caught up with me, and I realized that I was spiritually and mentally unfit to continue being an officer in the United States Marine Corps. So I resigned my commission, and I knew that I had to repair my mind, and I decided to repair my mind by studying philosophy. I felt that philosophy would help me out, because in my 2 tours in Vietnam, I always carried in my pack Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And when things got tough, I would turn to Marcus for a good advice. And that's philosophy. And so I decided philosophy would be my route back into sanity. So I went to university and studied under 7 great teachers, 7 great teachers who all understood that I was a professional soldier. I was going to go back and become a professional soldier again. And I was not going to become a philosopher, and I was not going to become an academician of any kind at all. So they knew I had a problem, and they worked on me. And I worked with a great Chinese scholar, Dr. Chang Chung-yung. I worked with a great Indian scholar, and this is going to be very important later, a great Indian scholar, Dr. Kashi Nath Upadhyaya. And he became a big influence in my life also. And I worked with some great Western scholars, Dr. William Boyer. I worked with him in educational philosophies, but especially in the realm of morality. He was deeply involved with the anti-war movement back in the United States, back in Hawaii, deeply involved in the anti-war movement. But he took me on, even though he didn't really like my profession at all. But he was a masterful scholar, and I knew I had to study with him. So I studied with him, and I studied with Greek philosophy with Dr. Edward Harder, another great scholar, wonderful, wonderful scholar. Studied existentialism, phenomenology under Dr. Nagley, and he was a great scholar also. So I worked with really great people. So after 6 years of that, I got a bachelor's degree and 2 master's degrees in philosophy, and I was on my way back to the Marine Corps. Now, this is at a time, 1975, January 1975, and there's a huge reduction in force going on. And I want my friends out there to understand why I love the United States Marine Corps so much. Because at that time, there was a huge reduction in force going on, at thousands and thousands of officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted personnel were getting kicked out of the military because the war was lost. Everybody understood the war was lost at that time. So there's the reduction of force going on, and I wanted to get back in. Well, the Marine Corps took me back in as a staff sergeant, and I will always be very, very grateful for that. But then my time with the Vietnamese wasn't over either, because I spent, after that, in 1976, I was assigned to the American Embassy in Bangkok, Thailand, where I worked for 6 years interviewing refugees from the Vietnam War. So this gave me another insight into the Vietnam. And this is also related to Zai Phong. I learned a lot more about what happened during those war years, because I was talking with thousands of former government soldiers. I was talking with just so many different people about all this. Then the time came when I went back to Vietnam in 1977 as part of a presidential commission sent by President Carter. It was the only time I've ever flown on Air Force One, but I was a staff member of that commission. So that was a very interesting time. So that was my first trip back to Vietnam, was in 1977. Later on, while I was at the American Embassy, I went back to Vietnam as a member of other commissions, for congressional commissions set, from the United States, and I went back on several different of those. Now comes the time I've retired from the Marine Corps, 1984, and I'm going back to Vietnam on a regular basis with my beautiful wife. My wife, beautiful wife, is Chinese, overseas Chinese, Thai. Doesn't particularly care for the Vietnamese too much, but she knows that old husband is really, really into going back and going over those battlefields again. So altogether, I've been back to Vietnam about 14 times since the end of the war, mostly touring battlefields and talking with veterans. I've talked to hundreds of veterans, North Vietnamese Army veterans, Viet Cong veterans, and also veterans from our South Vietnamese Army allies, previous allies. So going back like that so many different times, walking the battlefields, talking with veterans. And one thing that's so very, very interesting is when I went back to Vietnam, I've used the same travel agency every time, and they know that my desire is to see the battlefields and talk to veterans. So they put me into different places where I'm going to memorials and all these other kind of things where I can meet veterans that are going there to pay respects to the dead and things like that. So I'm going to these places and I'm meeting these veterans under these. And I want to say another thing is that in every case, I have been greeted with absolute politeness all the way through. I have not had one negative incident in 14 trips back to Vietnam. Everybody respects me because I'm a combat veteran. I identify myself immediately as a combat veteran. As a matter of fact, the general that I fought under in the South Vietnamese Army, General Ngo Quang Trung, is very, very popular in North Vietnam today. He's respected. He's very, very respected. He's a respected man. He was respected as an officer, as a moral and a good officer on the wrong side, but a good person. So he's respected, and because I served under him, and I make a special point of saying that I received the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry under him, then I get respect also. So it's one of these things that's win-win. But one of these things that came out of all my conversations with the North Vietnamese, former North Vietnamese soldiers in the Viet Cong, was they would refer to us as having kandam, which means, it's a good term. It's a beautiful term in Vietnamese. It means courageous, being noble in your courage, filled with bravery, that kind of thing. It's a good meaning. But every time they referred to themselves, it was always with the words he said. Now, I wondered about that. Why were they always? And this happened when I was talking with North Vietnamese in North Vietnam, and it happened when I was talking down in the South Vietnam with more of the Viet Cong as opposed to the North Vietnamese soldiers. They used the same term. It was always the same term. Over the years, it just began to kind of eat on me. Is what's going on here? So when I came back to Thailand, I have two friends, Chinese. They're scholars and also business people, but they followed the Vietnam War very, very closely. As a foreigner living in a foreign country, one of the first things that you learn how to do is you learn how to ask questions, because you are living in a world that you have no real understanding of. In other words, I've lived in Asia almost 60 years. In every day of those 60 years, I wake up every morning wondering how I'm going to screw up that day. What am I going to do wrong? And what am I going to learn? Every day of my life, I do that. Okay? So with that in mind, I have advisors. So I went to my two Chinese advisors and I asked them, what's going on here? Why are they referring to me and the French and the other Americans as kandam, and referring to themselves as Hishin. Now, Hishin means sacrifice. And sacrifice also has the idea of sacrificing something for a divinity, sacrificing something for a god, sacrificing self for something else. Okay, so it has that idea of sacrifice as an offering to something, as an offering. And so I asked my two Chinese friends, well, what's going on here? And then both of them gave me exactly the same answer. They don't know each other, but they gave me the exact same answer. They both asked me, well, what were you doing in Vietnam? Why were you in Vietnam? And I said, well, I'm a professional soldier, and I have to be loyal. I have to be loyal to my organization, which is the United States Marine Corps. I have to be loyal to my organization. I have to be loyal to my country. I have to be loyal to my Marines. I have to be loyal to the soldiers I'm fighting with. And we're all part of each other. I have to have that kind of loyalty. And so they looked at me and they said, okay. And I have to be brave when I'm doing it also. And we have to be brave together because we're all in this together. So we're fighting for each other. And this is classic, straight out of We Were Soldiers Once and Young with Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore and Joe Galloway. Straight out of We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And so we're fighting for each other. We're not fighting for mom's apple pie, the American way, Jesus, or anything else. We're fighting for each other. My two friends both said, oh, I see. You're telling me you have the morality of a dog. And that a dog is loyal. A dog will fight for its master. A dog will fight for each other. So you're telling me that you have the morality of a dog. But see, they are fighting for liberation of their country. A dog cannot fight for liberation of the country. Only a human can fight for the liberation of the country. Okay? So that's what they're fighting for. And they're making that distinction. And you're just too dumb to understand it. That's all. I'm thinking probably right now, my friends out there are feeling about the same way I did at the time. I was quite unhappy. I didn't really like hearing that. Okay, I didn't like having myself compared to a dog. On the other hand, what my friends told me was the truth. Now, one of the things that we as soldiers must always recognize is that combat and the truth that we live in as soldiers in combat is objective. Combat doesn't care whether you like something. They don't care what you think about something. They don't care how you feel about something. They don't care how you dream about something. Combat is objective. Reality is objective. And as I learned in the Marine Corps, when I enlisted in the Marine Corps at the age of 17, one of the first expressions I learned on the drill field was, reality is a bitch. And reality may not be right, but it's real. I learned those principles. And I've lived in combat on those principles. So when my friends told me this, I didn't really like what I heard, but on the other hand, I learned what the meaning of Zai Fong was. Okay? Zai Fong is sacrifice. Now, what do I mean as an example of sacrifice? So let's talk a little bit about that. What did I learn in my 14 trips to Vietnam? Well, I talked to a lot of people, and I talked to them a lot about their war experiences. And this was really, really interesting. For example, one time, beautiful wife, and on this occasion, I was traveling with one of my best and dearest friends, Colonel Sean Del Grasso, United States Marine Corps, retired and now deceased. The greatest Chinese linguist I ever knew in my life, and the only person I really ever truly respected, whose opinions on China really counted with me. A great Marine. So I was with Sean, and I was with beautiful wife, and we were outside of we were in Hoi An, which is near Da Nang, and we were looking at the battlefields around there, checking those out, and we decided to go over to the old Champa ruins in Mikishan. So we went over there, and then I saw this. I saw a kind of a middle-aged man wearing shorts. It was pretty obvious that he'd had the back of his buttocks and the back of his legs shot off. So I knew he was a combat veteran. So I walked over and I said, hello, and started talking. I said that I was a former platoon commander in this area, and that I'd done a second tour up along the DMZ, but I'd spent a lot of time fighting in this area as a infantry platoon commander in 1965 and 1966. And he looked and he said, "Oh, okay." And he said he identified himself as a company commander at that time. He was a company commander of a Viet Cong company. And so we started talking about what it was like to fight in the villages, and some of the villages, I still remember the names of some. And he said, "Oh yeah," he said that we were pretty heavy in there, kind of thing. And we were having a good discussion. And then I asked him if I could see his wound, and he said sure. So he dropped his shorts and showed me where the back of his buttocks had been shot off, and he said shot off by a Marine. So he said he shot off by a Marine, and so at that point I dropped my trousers and showed him the hole I had in my leg, left over from my experience. So he looked at the hole I had in my leg, and by this time my beautiful wife is yelling at me, for dropping my trousers and stuff like that, and looking at each other's wounds. And this is an act of bravery on my part that I should get the Medal of Honor for. I turned to my wife and I said, "Just be quiet. We're soldiers, and we're going to talk as soldiers. Just be quiet." So that was an act of utter bravery on my part, because I assume now my friends out there could understand who really runs the family here. So anyway, so we started talking, but one of the things that interested me so much about the realm of Zaifong is he would set, as soon as the Marines killed a large number of his company, he would go back over into Laos, and they would refit, retrain, rearm, and come back again, fight again, get basically kind of annihilated again by the Marines, go back into Laos again, retrain, and do that over and over and over again. That is Zaifong. Sacrifice. Over and over. There is no stopping. There is no hesitation. Now, in that realm of Zaifong, there is a total devotion. Devotion is the key to Zaifong. Devotion to a cause, devotion to a personality, Ho Chi Minh, for example. It is devotion to the country. It is sacrifice for the country. Okay? That's what they had. That's what Zaifong is. It's that sacrifice. And it's the sacrifice that comes without ego. This is the key. Now, I want our friends out there to understand something, the genius, the charismatic genius of Ho Chi Minh. When the North Vietnamese Army started, the birth of the North Vietnamese Army is shown in this book right here by Douglas Pike. A wonderful, wonderful book. Also, Pike wrote about the Viet Cong, this book also. Now, this is so interesting, because when they started off in the birth of the North Vietnamese Army, December 22nd, 1944, 34 people, and they started as armed propaganda teams. Education was always the key. One thing I want our friends out there to understand that is so important, and I'll make this more important later. I want all of our friends out there to understand education always came before weapons training, before anything. Education, the mind is the most important thing, not the technology. It's the mind. Zaifong takes place in the mind and the heart, and it takes place through education. Education for the communist was always more important than any kinds of weapons training or anything like that. That's the key to Zaifong. Now, what part of education do we understand? Education is, for one thing, you are educated to lose I, me, my. You are going to devote yourself to cause and country. That's what you're going to do. No more I, no more me, no more my. Only my country. Liberation of my country from Chinese, from French, and from the Americans, because the Americans have set up a puppet government down in South Vietnam. They are the new neo-colonialists, and they are there to rip us off, okay? We do not want foreigners in our country. So the appeal is nationalism. The devotion is also to Marx-Leninism. So it's a devotion to the charisma of Ho Chi Minh, the charisma of the party, the revolutionary theories of Marx-Lenin, and also the absolute devotion to nationalism that Vietnamese have. We never had a chance. The war was over before it even began. Now, another person who's famous for saying that is General Va Nguyen Giap. He became quite an entertainer late in his life. He used to take tourist groups in. And I've had several friends of mine that were in his home as part of a tourist groups that he'd go through. And he would look at the tourists and say, I never understood why the Americans came into Vietnam after Dien Bien Phu. They didn't understand anything about Dien Bien Phu. He said, I never could figure it out. Why did they come in? They should have known that they were lost before it even began. And, well, what did we understand about Dien Bien Phu? Sacrifice. Zaifong. He said, liberation. Zaifong. We didn't understand any of that. So the example I'm using with my Viet Cong, the company commander, it's never stopped. Now, I want to mention also, I had a real great buddy of mine, name I don't want to mention because he belonged to a special intelligence organization, but he was an expert on Vietnam, spoke absolutely fluent Vietnamese, and he was in Vietnam for many, many years with his organization. And he told me once that he tracked a Viet Cong regiment down south that had been literally wiped out 21 times and resuscitated 22 times before the fall. How do you fight people like that? Now, another thing that I want to mention in this, and I have to tell my friends out there, I didn't know whether to tell the story about the dog or not. I really had kind of second thoughts about that, but then I decided it's important for me to say this because we are facing another situation now, my friends, because there's another power in the area who has exactly the same way of looking at things according to Zai-Fong as the Vietnamese do, and that's the Chinese. I want us to think about this for a little bit. If you go to China right now, your mind will literally be blown by 8-lane highways, trains that are going faster than the speed of sound, huge buildings, luxury, Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, all that. Incredible levels of materialism. But one thing that the Chinese have never forgotten is their educational system. Their educational system still demands civics, history. And part of that history is all about how we Chinese were trampled on by the West when we were weak. We must always stay strong. We must always stay strong. And in all that realm of luxury that you see in modern day China, I can tell you right now, in the DNA of every Chinese, 1,400,000,000 Chinese, there is a DNA factor for Zai-Fong. In one day, if it came to that, over, say, Taiwan, we could have 1,400,000,000 Chinese screaming for American blood because of the return to the sacred motherland of Taiwan by foreigners who want to keep us from what we should have, what we should own, because they look down on us, because they treat us with contempt. That's all part of their educational system. It's all there. You can see it in their TV programs. You can see it the way they analyze the Korean War. Now, one of the things that I like to do is I like to watch Chinese TV. So I'm sitting there watching these. The way they interpret the Korean War is not the way the United States interprets the Korean War. I can tell you that right now. I want to go into a little bit more about exactly what Zai-Fong is in a kind of a little bit more of a philosophic sense also. One of the greatest books, I think the greatest book on religion ever written, was by our American philosopher, William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Now, the way James explains Zai-Fong will be like this. All humans at birth are born with a sense of lack. That's the first moment after birth. So you reach for mommy's breast or whatever, okay? The second moment after birth is desire to fill that lack. Desire to fill that lack, okay? And then from then on, seeking to fulfill lack. And we get ourselves involved in all kinds of emotions. We get attached to material things. We get attached to ideologies. We get attached to religion. And according to James, what we do is because we all have this DNA for devotion. Everybody has this DNA for devotion and this desire to fill that lack. Well, some of us by temperament become Catholics. Some become communists. Some become Democrats. Some become Republicans. Some become whatever. Ho Chi Minh, at the birth, understood that. Education. We are going to fill that lack. And when we fill that lack, we're going to get liberation. Liberation for the Vietnamese. Zai-Fong basically is a political thing. Now, the United States, those that were really sophisticated in the U.S. system in the war, they always claimed, okay, it's a political war. Well, what does political mean? Actually, it wasn't political at all. It was a religious war. The North Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, fought a religious war because what he did is he married the political with the transcendental and the religious. He married them. That was Zaifong. Zaifong was not just political. I mean, when we say political in the United States, we mean, okay, Democrats, sliming Republicans, Republicans sliming Democrats, and conflict and competition, and maybe the occasional get together to vote for something, useful. But basically a kind of a struggle for power. It's a struggle for power. Well, that's the realm of duality. Zaifong is in the transcendental realm. It's unity. It's oneness. There is no more I, me, my. It's not my power, my struggle, our struggle, none of that. It's doing something without any desire for a benefit for I, me, my. It's doing without that. It's a world without desire for anything personal. I would kind of like our friends out there to reflect on, well, what kind of world do we live in? I don't think I have to say too much about that. I want to close this out. My transformation to the world of Zaifong was completed after 24 years. I studied Zaifong for 24 years with a great teacher in Thailand. My great teacher is Assistant Professor Tassanee Sinsakul from Chulalongkorn University. So for 24 years, I worked on Zaifong and what it meant to me personally in this book. And now I understand Zaifong is not just political. It's not just military. It didn't exist just in Vietnam, but it exists within me. I could have my liberation. I could have my Zaifong, because liberation is simply learning through meditation, through having a good teacher, a great teacher. I can learn and I can be on the path to be without I, me, and my. Not in the way that my Viet Cong company commander did, but I can do this also. I can enter Zaifong as an individual.